Hi, I'm Totta, regional instructor here with the NWFA. Here again to talk a little bit more about transitions in flooring. In a previous video, we talked about how before we do any installation of the floor, part of our prep process is going through and undercutting these casings and door jambs so that the flooring can tuck underneath them neatly and cleanly. And now we're going to talk about that transition point where I transition to a different flooring in the home. So my wood floor is going to stop and I'm transitioning to something else. You can get pre-made transition strips of various kinds to transition to the type of flooring you're going to. This is what we commonly refer to as a T-mold. This one here is a reducer, and this one here is a common overlap threshold style. If I am transitioning to something that is about the same height difference down as my flooring, that'd be a good scenario to use a basic reducer like this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a couple other types of transition points. The first one we're going to start with is if I'm transitioning to carpet. A pre-made transition strip that would commonly be sold and used with the flooring for carpet would be one of these. You simply install your flooring up to the transition point and then set this overlap threshold on top of it, and then the carpet would come in after the fact and tuck up tight to this transition piece. One thing that's important with any type of transition is where that transition point happens. Ideally, if there's a door swinging right here, which it would in most homes, I want, when that door is shut, to be able to stand on this side of the door and only see wood, and stand on the other side of the door and only see the other type of flooring. So ideally, somewhere right close to the center of where that door swings is where I want that transition point to happen. Either right close to the center or slightly in further to the room that it's going into is where I always choose to set my transition point. So in this instance, that's carpet over there. I'm transitioning my floor up to carpet. You can use a pre-made one, or what I prefer is to make my own a lot of times out of the flooring material that I have. In that case, I've got my floor installed up to here. I'm gonna measure my distance to where I want that to stop. It's really close to 2 inches here in this instance. And then I'm going to rip a piece of flooring to that width. And then I just come back with a simple roundover bit. In this case, it's a 1/2 inch radius roundover bit, just to round that edge over cleanly. And it's gonna install like that. Put it in, fasten it down, and you can see I'm just going past that point of transition that we talked about. It's a nice smooth transition that's not gonna catch on anything, and it's gonna wear well as well. Now, in this demo, I'm using unfinished material. If this was pre-finished material, a lot of times I would do the exact same thing. I would just expect that this portion of the board here, I would need to touch up the finish to get it to match. Now we're gonna transition to a typical vinyl floor scenario. Oftentimes gonna be in a bathroom or a mudroom where someone has vinyl flooring, which is commonly not nearly as tall or thick as my wood flooring. It's gonna be somewhere closer to a 1/4 inch. So in this case, I do it very similar to what I just did with that carpet transition, except for that I'm going to make it overlap this vinyl a little bit. A lot of times in the real world, this is gonna be really jagged and not very cleanly cut. So you may have to trim that up to get it there. But what I'm gonna do is measure and cut my piece first so that it's wide enough to come past that point of transition. To do that, I often turn to this tool here. This is a combination square. I can set it on my flooring, okay, and then adjust this down to the height difference really quickly and easily, and then can transfer that to a board to get ready to cut it. So firstly, I measure that width and rip the board to here. So I rip it to the width I want. I'm then gonna measure that, transfer that down, so I know that's the height difference that I have between the two floorings. And then I'm also going to put a round over on it. And it's important which order you do those steps in. I'm going to put that round over on before I undercut and remove this material, because if I don't, then there's not as much of a flat surface for my bearing of my router to ride on. So I'm going to start by rounding this over. It'll then be something like this, and then I'll come back and remove this material to end up with a piece that's just like this here. So it's made to overlap this vinyl, that height difference, and then it's still got a smooth rounded transition at the front. So I would come in, drop it down, tap it in, and it ends up overlapping this, giving me a nice clean edge and a smooth transition point. All right, lastly, in this scenario, we're mocking this up as if this is a tile floor, which very commonly is really close or almost the same height as my wood flooring itself. Now this would be for a pre-made transition point, where commonly you would see T-mold transitions used to overlap the two. Obviously I would need to install that flooring, another piece of flooring in to do that. My preference whenever I do this is to avoid any elevation change in height if at all possible. So what I prefer to do in this instance is to cut a rip, to leave a gap, and then to fill that with some sanded caulk, and I'm going to show you how I do that. First, I'm going to measure the distance between my wood flooring and my tile. It's nice if it's consistent, but it's very often that it's not, so I need to adjust my piece accordingly. And I am going to measure the distance and then rip an additional amount off of my board. What I typically try to do is match the grout line spacing in the tile if there is some. You can see in this mock-up we don't actually have a grout line to match, so I'm going to just default to at least a 1/4 inch. So I measured that already and ripped my piece to this distance minus a 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to install this as I would any other floorboard. Pull it in, drop it down, shift it over. Assuming that's already glued and fastened well. Then I'm gonna come back and fill this gap with some sanded caulk, which you can get at most home centers, but I'm going to try to find something that matches the existing grout if there is some, as closely as possible. This is also, when it dries, gonna look really similar in texture, but it also is gonna remain flexible so that my floor has some room to expand and contract and move. I'm gonna start by taping off both of the floorings really well up to that transition point. Be sure to burnish the edge of that tape really well. I oftentimes will take this edge off too, just to try to make it as clean as possible. And then I'm gonna come and fill this gap. And when I do this, I'm actually trying to overfill it intentionally, given that time for that to work all the way into that gap down to the subfloor, and then expand out just a little bit. You can do this with a rag, but I prefer to use this tool if I have it. It's got a rubber tip on it, and I'm just going to clean that edge up like that. And then I'm ready to peel my tape. And that ends up with a nice transition point that's really clean looking. It should match the grout line really well, and it also gives you two surfaces that remain almost flush.